Kingside.com. Hello, let's do a quick video on dynamic JavaScript. This is one of the few videos where I'm going to insist that you go read the lecture first. This video won't make much sense unless you read the lecture first. Got that? Go read the lecture first. Then come back and look at this video. This video covers dynamic JavaScript. How do we use the JavaScript programming language to dynamically create content on our web page, to dynamically put something up onto a web page? Plain old HTML just sits there, but JavaScript can create content for the website and dynamically write it to the web page. So let's look at our two options. It's right line versus inner HTML. Do I want to use JavaScript's right line method to write HTML to the screen, or do I want to use a little of CSS and the document object module with the inner HTML property to write data to the screen? Let's look at it both ways. First up is document.writeLine. Go to the document object and execute its writeLine method. Write this HTML into the web page. Wherever this set of script tags and document writeLine exist, the headline number 1 will show up on the screen. It's big bold headline font. That is one way to dynamically write HTML to a web page. The second way requires two steps. First of all, you've got to create an HTML element like H1. Keep in mind, this is pure HTML. It's outside the script tags. The ID equal is I'm going to set an ID equal to this H1 tag to headline 2. That ID equal is very much required if you plan to dynamically write to this headline tag or H1 tag. Now I put a little placeholder here. It's not required, but it's useful. Number one, if your JavaScript is not working, you'll see the word placeholder and you'll know where you want to dynamically write the JavaScript to it. Number two, it just visually looks better to me than just an empty H1 tag. So that placeholder is not destined to be there very long. We plan to dynamically overwrite it or change it. And again, I like to put something in there so I can see it whether or not my JavaScript is running. This is the entire H1 tag here. Now we've all written H1 tags by this point. The only real difference here is, number one, I'm using the ID equal. I have to do that. And number two, I put that little placeholder in there just to hold its place before I get to write to it. I will also point out that you have to do this H1 tag first. The H1 tag has to come before we do the inner HTML. Now this is the line of code that will dynamically change that headline 2. The entire thing says go to the document object, run the getElementID method, and acquire or get the headline 2 element. Once you have the headline 2 element, I want to change this HTML to headline number 2. Let's break down this command and see what we're doing here. First of all, the document.getElementID. This is a command that is used more and more in JavaScript. It basically says go to my document object, go to my document, and find me the thing on that web page with the ID headline 2. Now notice the arrow, the double-ended arrow. That headline 2 that I have in getElementID but as a parameter, that has to match the ID of the thing I wish to access. For all intents and purposes, this command returns that H1 tag with the headline 2 ID. So once I have that H1 tag, I'm going to change that H1 tag. I'm going to go to its inner HTML property and set it equal to a new value, in this case headline number 2. Now look at the double-headed arrow. I'm replacing placeholder with the new text headline number 2, and onto the web page, if all goes well, is headline number 2. That is the second way to change or dynamically change the HTML that appears on a web page. You've got two choices. You can use a document.writeLine, or you can do this inner HTML. You can see the inner HTML requires a little bit more work, but it's not a whole lot. And I'll be honest with you, this is where it's going. Less and less people are using document.writeLine, and more people are using the inner HTML to change the HTML that appears on a web page. It's good to know both techniques, but the second one is the one that's going to be the way it's done in the future. Let's look at another example. Now, one thing that I did do well in the lecture that you're supposed to read is I always encouraged you to write functions to dynamically create HTML. So let's look at dynamic JavaScript and build functions that create HTML that we want to display on the web page. Here's the function makeHeader. It's taken pretty much verbatim from the lecture. Again, I hope you read the lecture first before doing this. The function makeHeader is going to build a chunk or a piece of HTML and return it to the user. We're going to create that HTML in a variable called data, and there's going to be 3 lines of code here that add to it. So I'm creating a local variable named data, and in the next 3 lines here, I'm going to add more and more HTML to it. Once I have that HTML built in the variable data, I'm going to return that HTML to the caller. Now, what I'm doing is building the web page in sections, and this is going to be my header section across the top of the screen. And whenever I want to put up a header on any web page, I can call this function and it will return to me a piece of HTML. Now, as we saw on the previous slide, one way to display that is to use document.writeLine. All I'm going to do is display the HTML created by the function makeHeader on the web page. An advantage of putting it in a function is if I have multiple web pages that are going to have the same header, I write the header once in that function, and then whenever I want to do it, I use a document.writeLine and put up that header. Again, with a function, we want to write once and use many times. If I have a dozen web pages on this site, I can create one makeHeader function and just call this function every time I want to put it at the top of a web page. So without a doubt, creating the function makeHeader is a good idea. The only question is, how do we then take that HTML and put it on the screen? Technique number 1, use document.writeLine. Technique number 2 is to use getElementID and inner HTML. So this little piece of code, again, is going to be an alternative to using document.writeLine. I've square boxed this new code that I've displayed on the web page. Keep in mind, some of this is HTML that's going to be executed outside of the script tags. Perhaps a more common way to change the HTML on the web page is to create a div tag. I'm going to create a div tag called header. This is the HTML outside the script tags, and I'm going to give it an ID equals header. If you're going to use inner HTML, you need to create an ID. So this ID of header, and I'm going to put a header placeholder in there. Again, that's not a requirement that I put a placeholder here, but I do intend to change the header and replace header placeholder with the dynamically created HTML that the function makeHeader uses. So again, this is outside the script tags. I set up a header where I want it to go on the screen. Then inside of script tags, I call document.getElementID, and I say access the header div. Look at the double-ended arrow. I am asking getElementID to retrieve this div thing. Now, we're using header in the terms of the big header that goes across the top of the screen, and what I want to do is dynamically replace that header with this JavaScript generated HTML. Go to the inner HTML, the header placeholder, and I say assign to it the output of makeHeader. Remember, makeHeader is going to return the data, all that chunk of HTML that we built up there, and it is going to replace the header placeholder with a nicely displayed header. The header created in the function make header. There you have it. The two techniques you have for writing dynamic HTML content to the web page using JavaScript is document.writeLine, that's option number 1, and using the inner.html property, that is option number 2. Inner.html does require that you set up an element in HTML that you wish to dynamically change. Document.writeLine is sort of the old way to do it. Using a div tag and get element by ID is a newer way to do it. If you were looking at an older web page, you'd probably see a document.writeLine. If you were looking at a web page that was recently created, I would say you're more likely to see this document.getElementById and using that to change the HTML that's displayed on a web page.